a Sith Lord entered a tomb. He was looking for the secret of immortality. What he found instead was something that had been dead for thousands of years and did not want to stay that way. It found him first. It reached into his mind and started pulling. He almost lost. One of the most powerful Sith Lords of his age, prepared, armed with techniques that most dark side practitioners never master, came within a fraction of himself of being erased and replaced inside his own body, not by something alive, by something that should have been dust. That is what Darth Andeddu left behind when he died. Not just knowledge, not just a holocron sealed inside a tomb on a world the galaxy forgot existed. Himself, waiting, patient, preserved in the dark side energy of a burial chamber, fed by a religion built entirely around keeping him ready for the moment. Something worth taking finally walked through the door. He had been waiting for thousands of years. He was not in a hurry. Nobody knows his name the way they know Revan, or Plagueis, or Vitiate. He made sure of that. Obscurity was the weapon he chose because it is the only weapon that never runs out. The most dangerous thing in the galaxy is the threat nobody sees coming. Darth Andeddu spent thousands of years becoming exactly that threat, building in silence, shaping the darkest obsession in Sith history from behind a veil of deliberate anonymity. Every Sith Lord who ever tried to cheat death was walking the road he built. Most of them never knew his name. That is the most terrifying thing about this story. Not the tomb, not what waited inside it. The most terrifying thing is that he reshaped the entire Sith tradition from a world the galaxy forgot to look for. And he did it on purpose, and it worked exactly the way he planned. This is the story of the man the Sith forgot, and why they never should have. The galaxy was already ancient when Andeddu came into it. Not ancient by the reckoning of stars, which measure their lives in billions of years, and find mortal civilizations too brief to notice, but ancient by the measure of beings who build things and name things and write their histories down so other beings can read them and understand where they came from. The Republic was young in those days, not the vast institution that would one day span 1,000,000 worlds and carry the weight of centuries of tradition and bureaucracy. Young and uncertain and still deciding what it was. The Jedi Order existed alongside it, but was itself still forming, still working out the boundaries of its philosophy, still in the process of becoming the thing it would eventually be. In the spaces between those two young institutions, in the darkness at the edges of the known galaxy, something much older was operating. The ancient Sith Empire sat at the far rim of explored space, a civilization built on foundations that predated the Republic by millennia. The Sith species had lived in that region before any Force-sensitive exile arrived to claim the name. They had their own traditions, their own relationship with the dark side, their own understanding of power and hierarchy, and the proper relationship between the strong and the weak. When the exiled Dark Jedi arrived among them and interbred with their species and inherited their world, they did not merely replace what was there. They combined with it. The result was something new, something that carried the worst impulses of both traditions and refined them into a philosophy so coherent and so seductive that it would survive the physical destruction of its home civilization and continue spreading through the galaxy for the next 25,000 years. The dark side flowed through that region of space the way blood flows through a living body. It was in the rocks and the soil. It was in the air over Korriban and in the silence over Ziost. It saturated the tombs that Sith Lords built for themselves in the Valley of the Dead. those enormous monuments carved directly into the red stone of a world that had been steeped in darkness long enough to develop a character of its own. Korriban was not merely a place where dark-side users lived. It was a place that had been shaped by generations of dark-side energy until the planet itself seemed to participate in the malevolence of its inhabitants. Visitors who were sensitive to the Force described it as pressure, as a weight on the consciousness, as the feeling of being watched by something large and deeply unkind. Into this world, Andeddu was born, not as an outsider, not as someone who had to adapt to the darkness around him, as a product of it, shaped by it from his first breath, as naturally at home in the saturated dark side environment of the ancient Sith Empire as any being could be in the place that made them. The details of his early life did not survive in any record accessible to later scholars. He saw to that himself. Eventually, but from what can be assembled from the fragments that remain, from the margins of old texts and the warnings carved by people who knew him, from the implications of what he later became, it is possible to reconstruct the essential shape of what he was before the title and the tomb and the terrible reputation that outlasted everything else about him. He understood the Force early, not with the gradual dawning that most Force-sensitive beings describe. That slow accumulation of awareness that builds over years of training and quiet meditation. For Andeddu, the connection arrived complete and overwhelming, as though the dark side had been waiting for him specifically and had simply been biding its time until the vessel it required was ready. He did not discover his power so much as he recognized it. The way you recognize something that was always yours. The dark side did not feel foreign to him. It felt like the truth of himself expressed in a form he could finally understand. What that connection showed him first was not what it shows most young Sith. Most young dark side users feel power when the connection first opens fully. They feel the ability to impose their will on the world around them. They feel the intoxicating difference between being someone the universe pushes around and being someone who pushes back. That feeling is what draws most of them down. For Andeddu, the first thing the dark side showed him was not strength. It was fragility, the full scope of his own fragility. The fact that every person around him was going to die. The fact that every structure built by mortal hands was eventually going to crumble. The fact that every empire and every bloodline and every accomplishment was going to end. And that the ending was not a distant possibility, but a certainty built into the fundamental nature of existing as a living thing. He saw mortality clearly, at an age when most beings are still comfortable ignoring it. And what he saw did not produce the numbness that sometimes comes with that kind of early clarity. It produced something harder, something colder. It produced a refusal. He was not going to accept a universe where the equation always ended the same way. He was going to find another answer. Not later, when he was older and had more power and more resources. Now. From the beginning, the search for a different answer to the question of death was going to be the organizing principle of his entire existence. From the earliest days of his training to the last moment of his physical life and beyond. This made him unusual in ways that people around him noticed before they fully understood what they were seeing. He studied differently from his peers. Where other young Sith focused on combat techniques and the aggressive applications of the Force, on the skills that would let them survive the political violence that was the default mode of Sith interaction, Andeddu went deep into areas that older masters found strange choices for someone his age. Sith sorcery, alchemy, ancient records about the nature of the Force itself, about what it was and what sustained it and what relationship it bore to the consciousness of the beings who wielded it. Records about spirit and essence and the mechanisms by which something could persist after the body it inhabited stopped functioning. He was a brilliant student by every account that exists. Brilliant in the way that makes instructors uncomfortable. Because a student who is genuinely more capable than the person teaching them disrupts the power dynamic that institutions depend on, and institutions built on power dynamics respond to disruption with hostility. He moved past what his teachers could offer him and started pulling from older sources, from materials so ancient they had barely been preserved and were only partially legible. He found what he was looking for not in the living tradition of Sith teaching, but in the archaeology of it, in the things that earlier generations had discovered and then partially buried because they were too dangerous to teach freely. What he found there was both confirmation and challenge. The dark side could, in some form, survive the death of its practitioner. The tombs of Korriban were built on this principle. The ancient Sith kings, whose burial chambers lined the Valley of the Dead, had not simply been interred there. They had put something of themselves into the stone, into the dark side energy that saturated those chambers, into the traps and wards and seals that preserved the quality of their presence long after the biological machinery shut down. You could feel them when you walked through the valley. That was not imagination. It was the residue of genuine power, left behind by conscious acts of will performed by beings who had understood, in the last moments of their existence, that something of them could persist if they did it correctly. But residue was not enough for Andeddu. A ghost is not a life. A presence in a tomb is not continuity. What he wanted was not to leave an echo. He wanted to keep going, to remain a fully functioning consciousness with all his faculties and all his power and all his accumulated knowledge intact, operating in the world, pursuing his purposes, not dimly haunting a location, but actively existing. The difference between what the old Sith kings had achieved and what he intended to achieve was the difference between a smear of paint on a wall and the painter still standing before the canvas. That gap between what had been done and what he believed could be done became the space he decided to spend his life in. By the time he was recognized as a full Sith Lord, his reputation was already unusual, not because he was not powerful enough. He was more than powerful enough. His command of the Force was already beyond what most of his peers could match, and his knowledge of sorcery and the deeper mechanics of the dark side was advancing into territory that made senior masters quietly nervous. The reputation was unusual because of the direction he was pointing all of that capability. Everyone else on Korriban was pointed outward, toward conquest, toward rivals, toward the accumulation of territory and influence in the political structure of the Sith Empire. Andeddu was pointed inward, toward himself, toward the problem inside himself. The problem that had no name in polite Sith discourse, because naming it was considered a kind of weakness. He was afraid of dying. He had decided not to die. Everything else was logistics. Korriban was a world full of other Sith lords. This was, in the ordinary calculation of Sith political life, an opportunity and a threat in equal measure. Opportunities to gain allies, to build networks of influence, to position yourself advantageously within the hierarchy of an empire that ran on exactly those dynamics. Threats because every peer was also a competitor. Every mentor was also a potential obstacle, and every alliance was a temporary arrangement waiting for the moment when the terms no longer served one party's interests. The Sith tradition of betrayal was not merely a cultural quirk. It was a structural feature. The system was designed to cycle. The strong eliminated the weak, which made the strong stronger, which made them targets for the next generation of strong, which eliminated them in turn. Andeddu observed this system with the detachment of someone who has already decided they are not going to participate in it on its own terms. He could not avoid it entirely. He lived within it. He navigated it. He survived it, which in itself was evidence of his capability, because surviving Korriban's political environment required a combination of power, intelligence, and awareness that most of its inhabitants did not possess in sufficient quantities. But he did not invest in it. He did not build the alliances and the networks and the carefully maintained dependencies that other ambitious Sith Lords spent their lives constructing. Those things required trust. And trust required leaving yourself open to the person you trusted. And leaving yourself open was the first step toward being destroyed by the opening. He watched the politics. He understood them. He simply did not believe in them as a path to what he actually wanted. Power over other Sith Lords was power that depended on those Sith Lords continuing to be weaker than him. It was relational power. It existed in the relationship. Take away the relationship, and the power went with it. What he wanted was something different. Power that did not depend on anything outside himself. Power that could not be taken by an opponent, or eroded by time, or extinguished by the biological failure of the body he currently occupied. What he wanted was not dominance. It was permanence. The longer he spent on Korriban watching the cycle operate, the more convinced he became that remaining there was itself the greatest risk he could take. Not because any individual rival had the power to destroy him, because the system as a whole was going to consume everyone in it eventually. The Sith Empire was strong, but he had studied enough of its history to recognize the pattern. It had nearly destroyed itself before. It would again. The forces internal to it, the constant competition, the endless recycling of betrayal and counter-betrayal, the way it burned through its own most capable members in the process of determining who was most capable, were not sustainable indefinitely. At some point, the math would stop working out in the Empire's favor. At some point, the losses would exceed the capacity to replace them. When that happened, he did not intend to be there. He left Korriban not as a fugitive and not as a defector and not as someone who had been defeated and was running from the consequences. He left as someone who had assessed his options and selected the one most likely to produce the outcome he wanted. The other Sith Lords he left behind could have the Empire. They could have Korriban and its tombs and its valley and its politics and its endless grinding competition for position within a hierarchy that was going to collapse anyway. He had a different project. He needed a different place to pursue it. What he needed was somewhere that was difficult to reach, saturated with dark side energy, and far enough from the centers of galactic power that no army was going to come looking for him with any regularity. He found it by going backward, through records so old that most of them were kept on stone rather than stored electronically, through fragments of navigation data from the earliest period of Sith exploration, through maps of the galaxy that had been made when the known space was much smaller and the unmapped regions much larger. He found references to a world at the heart of the galaxy's most dangerous region, the deep core. the place where stars crowded together so densely that the gravitational forces warped hyperspace itself. The place where navigation was not merely difficult but lethal for those who attempted it without specific knowledge of specific routes. The place that the galaxy, as a collective, had looked at and decided was not worth the difficulty of getting to. The place called Prakith, the deep core, is not somewhere the galaxy goes willingly. It sits at the very center of the Milky Way, where the concentration of stellar mass is so extreme that the physics of hyperspace travel breaks down in ways that standard navigation computers cannot reliably compensate for. Entire ships have been lost in the deep core without leaving recoverable debris, simply swallowed by the gravitational anomalies that make the region's hyperspace lanes so treacherous. The navigators who specialize in the deep core are considered a particular kind of specialist, people who have memorized routes so specific and so demanding that the slightest deviation from them can result in a ship being pulled into a mass shadow it cannot escape. Even they refuse certain paths. Prakith sat deep inside all of that. It was protected not by defenses of the conventional kind, but by the sheer mathematical difficulty of arriving there. The planet itself was dense and heavy, its gravity slightly stronger than comfortable for most humanoid species, its sky perpetually layered with cloud formations that blocked starlight and kept the surface in a state of permanent dimness. The dark side had been present there for long enough to change the character of the place in ways that went beyond what the geology and the climate could account for alone. There was something about the quality of silence on Prakith that was not merely the absence of sound. It was a weight, a presence in the absence. The feeling of a world that had been thinking the same dark thoughts for a very long time and had stopped bothering to be subtle about it. There was a species on Prakith when Andeddu found it. The Prakith, a humanoid people in an early stage of development, organized into settlements with belief systems and hierarchies and the particular kind of cultural confidence that comes from having existed long enough to forget that anything could fundamentally change your world. They had never encountered a being like him. They had never encountered Force users at all, except in the mythological register, in stories about powers from outside the ordinary world that belonged safely in the past. That safety was about to become unavailable to them. He arrived without warning and without ceremony. He did not announce himself. He did not send messengers ahead to prepare them for his arrival. He appeared among them in the way that overwhelming force always appears when it has decided that the conventions of prior announcement are unnecessary. He had power that they had no framework for. He had a will that was completely indifferent to their preferences. And he had, beneath the implacable exterior, a very specific plan for what this world was going to become. He took Prakith the way he took everything he wanted, completely, immediately, and with no available alternative left for anyone who might have considered resistance. The Prakith who submitted became servants. The Prakith who did not were made into the kind of object lesson that ensures future submission without requiring repetition. There was nothing performative about this. He was not doing it for the theater of power, not making examples because he enjoyed the spectacle. He was efficient. The goal was a functional world organized around his purposes. The means were whatever the means needed to be. He had no feelings about the process. He had targets. What emerged from the conquest over the months and years that followed was something more sophisticated than a simple occupation. Andeddu understood something that most conquerors either do not understand or do not care about. A conquered population that is merely afraid is a resource that requires constant maintenance. Fear has to be refreshed. The mechanisms of suppression have to be perpetually operated. A conquered population that truly believes in the legitimacy of the power over them is something else entirely. A self-maintaining system. He was not going to spend the next several centuries personally managing the minute-to-minute compliance of the Prakith. He had work to do. He needed them to manage themselves. What he constructed, with the patience and the long-term thinking that were already characteristic of everything he did, was a religion. Not in the way that most conquerors who claim divine status construct them, quickly and clumsily, announcing from a position of military dominance that they are to be worshipped. He let it develop. He provided the raw material and then stepped back and watched as the terrified imagination of people trying to make sense of something completely beyond their understanding did the rest. The Prakith built temples because people build temples to the things they fear. They created rituals because rituals give the sensation of agency in the presence of uncontrollable power. They told stories about him that grew more elaborate with each generation, accumulating details and mythology and interpretive layers, until the original truth, that this was a Sith Lord who had conquered their world because it suited him, was buried under something much more durable. He was their God, not their king, though he exercised all the functions of a king. Their God, the organizing principle of their cosmology, the being who existed outside the ordinary constraints of mortal existence and therefore had authority over it. They called the title God King eventually, and the grammar of that title was not accidental. Both parts carried weight. The king portion was the political dimension, the right to command armies and extract resources and make law. The God portion was the theological dimension, the claim to stand apart from the limitations that all other beings faced. Together they produced something that no military occupation could have produced: genuine devotion, not the compliance of people who have been defeated and have no other options. The faith of people whose entire picture of how reality worked had been reconstructed around his presence at the center. A god is much harder to betray than a ruler. You can betray a ruler if the opportunity is good enough and the consequences manageable. You cannot betray your god without first dismantling the architecture of your own belief, which is a much more difficult project than simply calculating the odds of a coup. He had studied the mathematics of power for a long time. He knew that military force produces compliance until the force is withdrawn or overwhelmed. He knew that political authority produces loyalty until someone more powerful arrives. But theology produces something different. Theology produces a kind of loyalty that lives inside the believer and does not require external reinforcement. He did not want guards. He wanted true believers. The distinction was, over the timescales he was planning for, the difference between a defense that could be breached and one that could not. He ruled, and he worked. The two things were not separate. The rule was the infrastructure for the work. The resources he extracted from Prakith's civilization funded his research. The labor he commanded from the Prakith built the structures his research required. The faith he had cultivated among them produced a population that would guard the results of his work even after he was no longer physically present to oversee it. Every aspect of the God King's reign on Prakith was, at its foundation, in service of the project he had been pursuing since childhood. The question, the only question, that had ever really mattered to him. What if I never had to die? His court was unlike any other Sith court that has been recorded. The old Sith Empire, in the period of Andeddu's existence and in the centuries following it, operated on a political culture of barely managed chaos. Senior Sith Lords maintained their positions through combinations of raw power, strategic alliance, and the willingness to destroy rivals before rivals could destroy them. Courts were full of faction and counterfaction, of advisors who were simultaneously advisors to your enemies, and of apprentices who were always calculating whether their master was still more valuable as a mentor than as a corpse whose position they could occupy. The culture was not merely competitive. It was designed to produce a specific kind of pressure, the kind that either breaks a being or forges them into something capable of surviving anything. Andeddu had no use for any of that. He had left it behind on purpose. His court at Prakith ran on a different system entirely, one that was simpler and, from the perspective of anyone serving within it, considerably more terrifying than the chaos of Sith political life. He trusted no one. He delegated nothing of actual consequence. Every person in his court had precisely as much authority as he chose to grant them in any given moment, and not a particle more. The moment any of them showed signs of accumulating the kind of influence or knowledge that could represent a structural risk, they disappeared. Not dramatically, not as a lesson for the others, just quietly, overnight, as though they had never been there. No one at court asked questions about where people went. Questions like that had a way of making you the next person who went somewhere. He maintained the court in a state of exquisitely calibrated anxiety. Just enough fear to keep everyone cooperative. Just enough hope of reward to keep them present. Just enough small demonstrations of favor to keep them believing that continued service was the rational choice. He had reduced every relationship in his life to its mechanical components, and was operating those components with the precision of someone who has long since stopped thinking about the beings inside the relationships as beings and started thinking about them as variables in an equation he was solving. He had no friends on Prakith. He had instruments. Some of those instruments served him for decades, which in the framework of his existence was analogous to a long relationship. But the nature of the connection did not change with time. They were useful until they were not useful. When they were no longer useful, or when what they knew about him and his work had grown to a volume that made their continued existence a liability, they were removed. He felt nothing about this. He had worked at feeling nothing about this for long enough that the work had become unnecessary. The feeling had simply stopped being available. Grief is a vulnerability. Attachment is a point of leverage that an enemy can use to move you. He had spent his existence removing leverage points, and eventually the person capable of the feelings that produced them had been so thoroughly dismantled that what remained was something cleaner and colder and considerably more functional. He directed that same analysis toward his own body. This was the step that separated him from other Sith Lords who sought power for its own sake or for the conventional rewards it produced. He had begun to think about his physical form not as himself, but as a container for himself. A vehicle. Something he was currently occupying but was not equivalent to. Most beings, most thinking beings of any species, experience their body as their self. When the body stops, the experience of self stops with it. The equation is simple and seems inescapable. Andeddu had been attacking that equation from multiple directions since early in his training, and by the period of his rule on Prakith, he was approaching the problem with the full resources of a wealthy and powerful civilization devoted entirely to whatever he wanted it to devote itself to. He extended his physical lifespan through techniques that other Sith Lords knew existed in theory, but rarely pushed to their limits. Dark side energy, properly channeled through the body over extended periods, can slow the biological processes of aging in ways that move the horizon of death significantly further out. It is uncomfortable. It requires discipline and practice, and a continuous investment of effort that most beings, even powerful ones, eventually decide is not worth the return. Andeddu found this calculation easy. Every additional year of physical life was an additional year to work on the permanent solution. Every decade extended was a decade he would not have had to refine his techniques. He used these methods without pleasure and without complaint, the same way he used everything as tools toward the only goal that interested him. But he was realistic about the limits. Life extension is not immortality. A slowed clock still runs down. The techniques he was using were buying time, not time indefinitely. There would be a point at which the biological machinery reached the end of what dark side intervention could coax out of it. He did not know when that point would come, but he knew with certainty that it was there. He was working against a deadline he could not precisely identify, which is perhaps the most focused environment for problem solving that a sufficiently motivated mind can operate in. The problem, reduced to its essential form, was this: consciousness does not require a specific biological container. Force-sensitive consciousness, in particular, seems to have a relationship with the Force itself that is not fully reducible to the neurology of the brain in which it resides. The dark side nexus points of the galaxy, the places where the dark side energy was so concentrated that it had taken on qualities that seemed almost like personality, demonstrated that dark side will could persist without a biological host under certain conditions. The tombs of Korriban demonstrated it more specifically, because those were not natural accumulations but deliberate constructions made by conscious beings who had put intentional effort into preserving something of themselves in the stone and the darkness. If something of a self could persist, then more of a self could persist. And if more of a self could persist, then in principle, all of a self could be preserved, completely, intact, fully functional, transferred to a new container before the old one failed. The technical obstacles were immense. The precise conditions required were complex to establish and difficult to maintain. The moment of transfer itself was a period of extreme vulnerability during which everything could be lost if the process went wrong. But these were engineering problems, not fundamental impossibilities. The question was not whether it could be done. The question was whether he could figure out how to do it correctly in the time available to him. He built a research apparatus on Prakith that consumed resources on a scale that would have been shocking to any external observer. The dark side techniques he was testing required test subjects, and test subjects were drawn from the Prakith population in numbers that the theology of the God King had made available by defining participation as the highest spiritual calling available to ordinary beings. The nature of what the experiments actually involved was not something the participants survived with enough coherence to describe. Andeddu documented everything with meticulous precision, every failure, every partial success, every intermediate result that opened a new line of inquiry. The documentation was not kept anywhere that anyone else could access it. The research record existed only in his own mind, and in the device he was building to contain and transmit it. He called the device a holocron. The Sith tradition already knew what holocrons were. They were force-imbued recording devices, crystalline structures that could store enormous amounts of information in a form accessible only to Force users, presided over by a gatekeeper personality that filtered access and mediated between the stored knowledge and the person seeking it. Andeddu's holocron was all of that. But it was more than that. He spent years encoding into it not just the record of his research and the technical knowledge of his techniques, but something of himself, his voice, his manner of reasoning, his responses to questions, his philosophy, his warnings, his intentions. He wanted the holocron to be a presence, not just a library. He wanted someone who opened it to feel that they were in a room with him, not reading a document he had left behind. He wanted the gatekeeper to be him, as completely as he could make it, so that the transfer of knowledge would carry with it enough of his essential character that the recipient would understand not just what he had done, but why and how he thought. The distinction mattered because the techniques he was encoding were not the kind that could be safely applied by someone who only understood the mechanics, the philosophy that surrounded them, the precise framework of intent and will and understanding of the Force that made them work rather than killing the person trying to use them, required transmission in a form that went beyond instruction. He poured himself into the holocron. Not literally, not yet. That would come later, in the final stage of his preparation, when the construction was complete and the tomb was ready. But the process of creating the gatekeeper was itself a kind of rehearsal for what he intended. He was practicing the transfer of his self into a non-biological form. He was testing the techniques on a smaller scale, in a safer context, learning where the difficulty lay and how to manage it. The results confirmed that the full project was possible. They also confirmed that it was extremely dangerous and that the margin for error was narrow enough to demand absolute precision. He had expected both of those things. He continued working. His research eventually coalesced around a technique that the Sith tradition would later call essence transfer. The name is deceptively simple. It describes a process by which the consciousness of a Force user, their will and awareness and personality and accumulated knowledge, is projected outward from a dying body and caused to take root in a new host. The body is abandoned. The self continues. The continuity of experience is maintained across what would otherwise be a terminal interruption. The technical execution requires precise preparation of both the departing host and the receiving one. A sustained act of will at the moment of departure and specific conditions in the Force environment surrounding the transfer that either support the process or undermine it. He mapped these conditions exhaustively. He developed protocols for preparation. He tested components of the process in ways that did not require a full transfer to evaluate, that let him check the individual elements of the technique against their predicted performance and refine them when the reality diverged from the theory. The work was painstaking. It was also, by his own assessment, the most important work being done anywhere in the galaxy at the time he was doing it. Other Sith Lords were fighting wars and building empires. He was solving death. The holocron that stored this knowledge, when it was complete, was the most dangerous single object he had ever created. He was aware of this. He chose a location for it that matched the seriousness of what was inside it. The tomb he had been constructing in the stone of Prakith, built to house his remains when his body finally stopped, was already an extraordinary structure. He had designed it with the full scope of his paranoia translated into architecture. Corridors that led nowhere. Chambers that contained traps of such sophistication that the unprepared Force user who entered them would not have time to understand what killed them. Dark side wards that were not merely defensive but reactive, connected to something in the nexus that could assess the person who had triggered them and calibrate the response accordingly. He had built a tomb that functioned as a weapon, that protected its contents not through passive resistance, but through active hostility. The holocron went into the deepest chamber, into a room he had designed specifically for it, a space in the stone of Prakith, where the dark side energy concentrated so intensely that the air itself felt different, heavier, more present. He placed it there and sealed the chamber. And then he returned to his reign and his research, and the daily administration of a civilization devoted entirely to his purposes. And he waited for the techniques to be ready, waited for the conditions to be right, waited with the patience of someone who had always understood that good outcomes require adequate preparation, for the moment when the preparation would need to become the act. He had also done something that no technical description of essence transfer can fully account for, because the mechanism behind it is not entirely understood even by those who study Sith lore most deeply. He had found a way to put something of himself into the tomb itself, not the holocron. Something more diffuse and more persistent. A presence encoded in the dark side energy of Prakith, sustained by the nexus that he had spent centuries strengthening through ritual and sacrifice, and the concentrated faith of his followers. It was not the full transfer he was working toward. It was a fragment, a guardian, something that would persist in the stone and the darkness and be capable of responding to intrusion, of assessing the nature of the being that had come, of acting within limits on the physical world around it. The logic behind this was the same logic that drove everything he did. Redundancy. If the full transfer worked as planned, the fragment in the tomb would be irrelevant. If it did not, if something went wrong in the moment of death that he could not account for in advance, then the fragment would persist. Something of him would endure, something capable of waiting and of watching and of seizing opportunities as they presented themselves across whatever timescale it took for the right opportunity to arrive. He was building himself a fallback. He was engineering his own afterlife with the same systematic thoroughness that he applied to everything else. The years of his reign grew. Decades. Then, more decades. The Prakith lived their shorter lives within the span of his. Generation after generation, born into a world that had never known anything other than the God King. For them, he was not a historical figure or a conqueror, or even a tyrant in the conventional sense. He was the frame of reality, the fixed point around which everything else moved. Children born on Prakith during his reign grew up and had children of their own who grew up and had children, and all of them lived under the same presence, the same God King who did not age in any way visible to them, who did not weaken, who appeared in the same places with the same authority and the same terrifying capability across the entire span of living memory. This was partly the life extension techniques maintaining his body beyond its natural capacity, partly the deliberate management of his public appearances to minimize occasions when the signs of age might be visible, and partly the dark side energy itself, which had been saturated into his body so completely over so many decades that the usual biological markers of time's passage had been substantially altered. He did not look young, he looked timeless, which was different and more effective. Youth implies a beginning, that aging will eventually conclude. Timelessness implies something that operates outside those categories entirely. He cultivated the appearance of timelessness with the deliberateness of someone who understood its value. His purges became more frequent as time passed. This was not, as it might appear from outside, evidence of increasing instability. It was evidence of an increasingly sophisticated analysis of risk. The longer any individual served in proximity to him, the more they knew. The more they knew, the more dangerous their continued existence. The simplest way to manage the accumulating risk represented by any given person was to remove them when the accumulated knowledge had reached a threshold that he calculated as too significant to leave operational. He did not hate the people he removed. He did not feel triumph over them or satisfaction at their elimination. They were variables that had become liabilities. The appropriate response to a liability is to address it. The court learned to operate in a culture of impermanence. No one expected a long career in the God King's service. No one built long-term plans that depended on continued proximity to him. You served, you were useful, and you tried not to accumulate the kind of knowledge or influence that would make him look at you with the particular quality of attention that preceded a quiet disappearance. If you were lucky, your usefulness outlasted his interest in eliminating you before he had found a replacement. If you were not lucky, you went where everyone who served him long enough eventually went. He did not lose sleep over any of it. He was too busy. The work was always the work. The research continued on its own track, regardless of the administrative realities of running a civilization. Tests refined. Techniques improved. The margin of confidence in the essence transfer method growing incrementally with each year of dedicated effort. He was, in his assessment, getting close to something that would work. Not perfectly, not without risk, but close enough to be executable when the moment came. When his body finally reached the end of what dark side technique could coax from it, he would have something ready. The moment arrived, as it always arrives, without sufficient warning. Not because he had not prepared for it. He had prepared for it obsessively across his entire existence. But preparation and readiness are not the same thing. You can know exactly what is coming and still be caught by the reality of it arriving. His body had been sustained well beyond its natural capacity for so long that when it finally began to fail, the failure was rapid rather than gradual. The mechanisms he had put in place to maintain it were overwhelmed sequentially. Each one held for a time and then gave way, which accelerated the pressure on the next one. He had understood this was a possibility. He had developed contingencies for it. He died in his tomb. This was deliberate. He had arranged to be in the tomb when the end came, surrounded by the strongest dark side nexus on Prakith, in the physical location where his preparations were most concentrated, where the conditions he needed for the transfer were most completely in place. The servants who had helped carry him there did not leave the tomb afterward. They could not be permitted to carry accounts of what they had seen. They became part of the ritual, part of the dark side energy that their deaths fed into the nexus at the crucial moment. Whether the transfer worked in the full form he had intended, is a question that the fragments of available information do not answer cleanly. What is clear is that something persisted. The presence in the tomb did not dissipate. It remained, and it was active, and it was in some meaningful sense Andeddu. Not merely a recording of him or an impression of him, but something that could respond and think and intend. Whether that presence contained the full continuity of his consciousness, or whether something was lost in the moment between life and whatever came after, is a question that only a being capable of comparing the pre-death Andeddu, the post-death presence in the tomb, could answer. And no such being existed, or has existed, since. The Prakith faithful mourned him with the extravagance appropriate to the death of a god. Prakith had organized itself around his existence for so many generations that the concept of a world without him had become literally unthinkable. The ceremonies lasted weeks. Sacrifices were made on a scale that would have been remarkable in any context. The priests who had served him during his life transformed into guardians after his death, establishing structures and hierarchies specifically designed to persist across generations. Their function was defined with precision. The tomb was to be protected. The holocron inside it was to be guarded. No intruder was to be permitted to disturb the rest of the God King. He was not gone. He was sleeping, between one form of existence and another, gathering himself. The duty of the faithful was to ensure that the space between those forms remained undisturbed for as long as the God King required. The belief that he would return was not an accident of theology. He had planted it deliberately in the faith structure he had cultivated over centuries, not because he was certain he would return, because he wanted his followers to believe it, so that they would protect the conditions that made return possible. If the essence transfer had worked fully, he would eventually find the right vessel and emerge from the tomb in a form capable of directing his own return. If it had worked partially, the fragment that persisted in the darkness would need time and the right opportunity to reconstitute itself sufficiently to act. Either way, the tomb and the nexus needed to be maintained. The faithful needed to remain faithful. The planet needed to remain a functioning dark side stronghold, rather than a ruin discovered and dismantled by whatever came after him. They called themselves different things across the generations that followed. The names changed as the original institutions evolved, and the specific details of doctrine mutated through the interpretive processes that happen to any faith across centuries of transmission. What did not change was the core commitment. The God King was sleeping. The tomb must be protected. Anyone who approached without permission was a desecration. Anyone who attempted to breach the tomb was an enemy of the god himself. And enemies of the god had no claim to survive the attempt. Thousands of years passed. The old Sith Empire that Andeddu had once been part of and had decided to escape from eventually destroyed itself, exactly as he had projected it would. The Republic declared victory. The Jedi hunted down what remained of the dark tradition. For centuries, the galaxy believed the Sith were gone. They were not gone. They were distributed, hidden in exactly the kinds of places where Andeddu had hidden himself. His particular form of hiding, behind a veil of deep-core navigation difficulty and a civilization of devoted defenders, was more complete than most. The galaxy did not know Prakith existed in any meaningful sense. The deep core kept its secrets the way deep water keeps its secrets, through simple physical inaccessibility. On Prakith, the cult endured, not unchanged. Nothing endures across millennia without accumulating the mutations that time and the human tendency toward interpretation inevitably introduce. Specific technical understanding was gradually replaced by ritual approximation. Precise doctrine evolved into mythology, but the emotional core, the absolute commitment to the protection of the tomb and the certainty of the God King's eventual return, remained intact across every generation. The dark side nexus around the burial site continued to grow, fed by generations of ritual sacrifice and concentrated faith and the lingering intelligence of whatever Andeddu had stored in the stone. By the time the wider galaxy would finally send someone to Prakith who was looking for what it actually contained, the planet was saturated in dark side energy to a degree that made it feel fundamentally different from any other world in that region. Not dangerous in the ordinary sense, conscious, aware. Like the planet itself had been thinking the same thoughts for so long that the thoughts had become part of the environment, as ambient and as inescapable as the gravity. That quality of presence was not imagination. It was him, or what remained of him, or what he had made of himself in the darkness over thousands of years of waiting and watching and learning to operate within the constraints of whatever form his existence had taken after the moment of death. The thing in the tomb was patient. It had to be. It had nothing to do but wait for the right opportunity. And it had been waiting for an extraordinarily long time, but something was coming. Something the darkness in that tomb would finally have reason to stir for. A Sith Lord of a new age, serving a master who needed what that tomb contained. A scholar and a warrior both, capable enough to survive the deep core approach, and powerful enough to fight through the faithful who would die before they let anyone past them. Someone whose arrival at Prakith would set in motion the last and most terrifying chapter of Darth Andeddu's story. The God King would not have to wait much longer. In the centuries after his death, the thing that persisted in the tomb had time to observe. It had very little else to do and, in its particular form of existence, no means to rush what could not be rushed. The fragment of Andeddu that remained in the dark side nexus of Prakith was not unconscious during those millennia. It was not suspended in some dreamless void. It was aware. Aware with the particular attenuated quality of awareness available to a consciousness stripped of the biological infrastructure it had once occupied. A mode of perception that was different from living thought in ways that were difficult to translate into terms that living beings could fully grasp. He perceived the faithful who maintained his tomb. He perceived their rituals and their devotion and the specific texture of the dark side energy they fed into the nexus with each generation of sacrifice. He perceived intruders when they came, which was rarely, and which never ended well for the intruder. He perceived the deep background hum of the galaxy's force energy, distant and diffuse through the stone and the dark side saturation of Prakith, like sound traveling through water, muffled, indistinct, but present. The galaxy was doing things. He could feel the broad shapes of it without the detail. Large movements in the Force, wars and extinctions, and the rise and fall of power in configurations. He could not fully map from inside his tomb, but could feel as pressure and change, and the particular resonance that great Force events produce in the living Force even when they happen at great distance. He felt the great hyperspace war in this way. The cataclysm that destroyed the old Sith Empire sent tremors through the Force that reached Prakith as a kind of thunder, distant but unmistakable, the sound of something enormous coming apart. he felt the aftermath. The silence that followed the war, the long quiet of a galaxy that believed the Sith threat was ended, had a particular quality. A smug stillness that he found both irritating and predictable. He had known the Empire would fall. He had arranged his existence accordingly. What happened to it was confirmation, not surprise. He felt the Sith tradition rebuilding itself in fragments across the following centuries. Individual practitioners scattered and hidden, finding each other or failing to find each other, and working alone. He felt the emergence of Darth Bane's Rule of Two philosophy, that fundamental restructuring of the Sith survival strategy that reduced the tradition to a pair at any given time and hid them inside the Republic, where the Jedi could not locate them. He did not evaluate these developments as good or bad. They were information. Information about the state of the thing he had once been part of and had long since determined to be peripheral to his actual concerns. What he was watching for, with the patience of something that no longer had a heartbeat to mark the passage of time, was an opportunity, a specific kind of opportunity, a Sith Lord of sufficient power and knowledge to navigate the deep core, to survive the defenses of his tomb, to enter the burial chamber and find what waited there. Not because he wanted to teach anyone, not because he had any interest in the continuation of the Sith tradition as an institution, because the right visitor, properly managed, could become the vehicle he needed, could carry the holocron out of the tomb and into the wider galaxy where its knowledge could be applied. Or, depending on the strength of the visitor and the precise conditions of the encounter, could become something more useful still. He had always believed in preparation over hope. He had always believed that the desired outcome required constructing the conditions for it, rather than waiting passively for those conditions to arrive. His form of existence after death did not fully allow for the kind of active preparation that had defined his living years. But it allowed for a version of it, a slower, more limited, more patient version. He worked on himself in the darkness, on the fragment of consciousness that persisted in the Nexus, on the techniques he had encoded in the holocron, which he could access from within the Nexus because he had designed the holocron partly as an extension of himself, and the connection between the two ran both directions. He was, in the most clinical possible terms, maintaining himself, practicing, not decaying, not fading, sustaining the quality of presence in the Nexus at a level that a sufficiently powerful and perceptive intruder would encounter as something beyond residual dark side energy. Something that could think, something that could respond not just reactively but strategically. Something that could, under the right circumstances, make an offer. The offer would be the most dangerous thing Darth Andeddu had ever done. More dangerous than the conquest of Prakith. More dangerous than the research that had cost so many Prakith their existence. More dangerous even than the moment of death itself, when everything he was had been balanced on the edge of complete extinguishment. The offer would be dangerous because it required, for the first time in his existence, extending something toward another being. Not trusting them, he would never do that, but using the appearance of a transaction to draw them close enough that the real transaction could happen without their full understanding of what was being exchanged. He was waiting for someone to come looking for immortality, because that was the kind of person who would come to Prakith. Not a Jedi who would approach the tomb as a site of darkness to be neutralized and would not be looking for what it contained. Not a common criminal or treasure hunter, who would be killed by the outer defenses before getting close enough to matter. Someone who knew what the holocron was and what it contained. Someone who needed what was in it badly enough to attempt the deep core and fight through the faithful and enter the tomb. Someone who was, in the most fundamental way, already walking the path that Andeddu had walked, already asking the same question, already afraid of the same ending. Someone like him. That person was going to come eventually. He was certain of it, the way he was certain of very few things in that reduced existence. Not with the confidence of evidence, but with the confidence of logic. The knowledge in the holocron was unique. There were Sith Lords who would spend entire careers looking for it. There were Masters who would send their most capable servants to retrieve it. The galaxy was full of dark side users who had encountered the outer edges of what conventional Sith knowledge could offer them and were looking for something deeper, something older, something that operated at the level of the problem rather than the level of the symptom. The problem was death. The symptom was every other obstacle they faced. The holocron contained the most serious attempt ever made to address the problem directly. Anyone who knew it existed was going to want it. And when they finally came, the thing waiting in the darkness of Prakith was going to be ready for them. It had been ready for a very long time. Readiness was the only thing it had been able to practice. And Darth Andeddu had always been very good at practice. The galaxy that eventually sent someone to Prakith was not the same galaxy Andeddu had left behind. Thousands of years had passed. The civilizations he had known were gone, or so thoroughly transformed that he would not have recognized them. The Republic had risen to its fullest extent, and then collapsed under the weight of a Sith conspiracy so long in the making that its architect had been planning it for decades before most of the people it destroyed had been born. The emperor that most of the galaxy knew about, Palpatine, had ruled and been destroyed. The empire he built had risen and fallen in its turn. A new republic had emerged from the wreckage, and then a galactic alliance. And then that too had passed through fire and come out the other side, in a form that bore the wounds of what it had survived. By the time the events that would finally disturb Andeddu's rest began to unfold, the calendar read approximately 137 years after the Battle of Yavin. The galaxy was old in the way that civilizations become old when they have been through enough catastrophe that the catastrophe itself has become part of the background noise. There had been so many wars in living memory, so many resurgences of power that should have been extinguished and was not, so many revelations that the thing everyone thought was over was in fact not over, that a kind of exhaustion had settled over the institutions that still stood. Not defeat, something quieter and harder. The exhaustion of people who have been fighting for a very long time and understand that they are going to have to keep fighting. Into this exhausted galaxy, the one Sith had arrived. They were not the Sith most people thought they knew. The tradition that the galaxy had encountered across the previous century, the rule of two that Darth Bane had established to preserve the Sith through the long centuries when open warfare was impossible, produced exactly two Sith Lords at any given time. One master, one apprentice. The galaxy had been shaped by the consequences of that system, by the patience of Darth Sidious pulling strings from inside the Senate while hiding his true nature, by the Emperor's long game that eventually consumed the Republic from within, by the war against the rebellion that followed, by the death of Palpatine and the apparent end of the Sith tradition he represented. People had believed the Sith were finished. The Jedi had come back. The galaxy had found something like balance. Again, it had not found balance. What it had found was a pause. The pause ended when a man called Asharadhet made a series of choices that took him from Jedi Knight to Tusken Raider to prisoner of the Yuuzhan Vong to something entirely different. The Yuuzhan Vong had come from outside the known galaxy, a species with no connection to the Force and a deep ideological hostility to technology, and their invasion had carved a scar across galactic civilization that would take generations to fully comprehend. During that invasion, Het had been captured. What the Vong did to him during his captivity changed him in ways that could not be undone. They embedded their organic technology in his body, coral-like growths that attached themselves to his nervous system and his biology, that gave him certain capabilities and cost him a great deal more. They changed the architecture of what he was at a level below the reach of anything he could do about it. He survived the captivity. He survived the invasion. He did not survive it unchanged. The seeds the Vong had embedded in him were slowly killing him. Slowly, in the sense that the process was measured in years rather than hours, but with a certainty that his own not inconsiderable Force abilities could not arrest. He was dying. The timeline was not fixed, but it was finite. And Het, who had by this point discarded his Jedi identity as thoroughly as a skin shed from an old self and rebuilt himself as Darth Krayt, founder and ruler of the One Sith, was not interested in a finite timeline. The One Sith operated on a principle that was, at its foundation, a rejection of Bane's rule of two. Krayt did not believe that the Sith needed to limit themselves to a pair. He believed the limitation was a response to a specific historical problem: the tendency of Sith in large numbers to destroy each other faster than they could build collective power, and that the solution to that problem was not permanent reduction of numbers, but reformed discipline. A hierarchy, a pyramid structure in which Krayt occupied the apex and every other Sith Lord in the tradition served beneath him, bound not by the master-apprentice dyad, but by the logic of an entire order sworn to a single vision, his vision. They hid on Korriban for decades, training and planning and waiting for the moment when they could emerge into the open. When they finally emerged, they hit fast and they hit everywhere. The Galactic Alliance found itself fighting a war against an enemy that had been preparing for longer than any of its intelligence services had known to watch for. Coruscant fell. The Galactic Alliance was forced into terms that gave Krayt effective control of the galaxy. Asharadhet, the Tusken Raider, who had become a Jedi, who had become a Sith Lord, sat on the Imperial throne. But the Vong seeds were still in his body, still spreading, still counting down. He needed a solution, urgently and without the option of indefinite delay. His healers and his sorcerers had tried everything within the reach of conventional Sith technique and found the limits of what conventional technique could accomplish. What he needed was something older and deeper and more fundamental than conventional technique. What he needed was the thing that Darth Andeddu had spent his entire existence developing. He needed the secret of immortality itself. Krayt knew about Andeddu. He had made it his business, over his long years of preparation and study, to know about every relevant piece of Sith history that had a bearing on the problems he faced. Andeddu was not easy to find in the historical record. The God King of Prakith had not been a publicly prominent figure in the ancient Sith Empire. He had left deliberately and had taken most of the records of his existence with him. But fragments remained in the oldest archives, in texts so ancient they were barely legible even to specialists. References to a Sith Lord who had gone further into the question of death than anyone before or after him. References to a holocron that contained knowledge so dangerous that those who knew of it either sought it desperately or wanted it destroyed. References to a world in the deep core where the dark side was so saturated into the very rock that the planet itself seemed alive with malevolent intent. Krayt could not go himself. His condition made long travel in difficult space too great a risk, and the deep core was exactly the kind of difficult space that could turn fatal without warning. He needed someone he trusted with the mission, which on the spectrum of his actual relationships meant someone whose capability he had personally verified and whose investment in his survival was sufficient motivation to take the risks the mission required. He sent Darth Weirlock. Darth Weirlock III was not a being that the casual observer would immediately identify as one of the most dangerous people in the galaxy. He was a Chagrian, blue-skinned, with the long brow horns called lethorns that his species developed over a lifetime of dark side immersion into something that had changed their character from ornamental to vaguely threatening. He was a scholar, a master of Sith, languages and sorcery in the academic sense, someone who had spent his life in texts and archives and the reconstruction of techniques that most other Sith Lords found too abstract to bother with. He was not a conventional warrior. He did not have the combat record of some of the One Sith's more aggressive members, the ones who had proven themselves on battlefields and in dueling rings. He was, however, Krayt's most trusted instrument, not the most powerful in the raw force sense, the most trusted. The distinction mattered enormously in an organization built on Krayt's personal authority, because trusted in Krayt's framework meant something more specific than merely loyal. It meant capable of operating without constant oversight, capable of making the right decisions without being told what the right decisions were in each new situation, capable of navigating complexity and ambiguity and difficulty without losing sight of the objective, capable of being sent to one of the most dangerous locations in the galaxy to retrieve one of the most dangerous objects in existence and actually coming back with it. Weirlock had served as the voice of Krayt in the most literal sense. When Krayt could not appear personally, Weirlock spoke with his authority. He carried that weight with a composure that impressed even the other Sith Lords around him, who were not, as a group, easily impressed by composure. He was calm in the way that certain very dangerous things are calm. Not because nothing was happening inside, because what was happening inside was so thoroughly under control that the surface remained undisturbed regardless of the pressure below it. He studied the available information about Prakrith and Andeddu with the thoroughness of a scholar who understood that the quality of preparation determines the quality of outcome. He read everything that existed in the One Sith's archives about the God King of Prakrith and what the records said about the tomb and the holocron. He read the navigation data for deep core approaches and selected the route most likely to deliver him to Prakrith without killing him in the attempt. He spoke with every source he could locate who had any peripheral knowledge of Andeddu or the world he had ruled. Most of those sources knew very little. What they knew was enough to establish the essential parameters of what he was walking into. He was walking into a world defended by thousands of years of accumulated religious devotion, guarded by people who had been raised from birth to view exactly what he was about to attempt as the worst thing a being could do. He was walking into a tomb designed by one of the most paranoid and intelligent minds in Sith history, filled with defenses that had been laid specifically to kill Force users of exactly his capability level. And he was walking into a confrontation with something in that tomb that the fragments of available information described in terms that even an experienced Sith scholar like Wylock found worth taking seriously. He went anyway, because Crate had asked him to, and because Wylock, for all his scholarly distance and his composed exterior, had a core of ambition and capability that the mission fit precisely. This was the kind of thing that mattered. Not every Sith Lord got the chance to go to Prakith and come back with the oldest secret of their tradition. He intended to be the one who did it. The approach to Prakith through the deep core was exactly as difficult as the navigation data had indicated, and as dangerous as the history of ships lost in that region suggested. Wylock flew the route himself, not trusting the calculation of the approach to anyone else. The gravity anomalies that made the deep core lethal to unprepared navigators were not random. They followed patterns, but the patterns were complex enough that a moment of inattention or a slight error in the calculation of a single jump could translate into a vector that put a ship into a mass shadow at speeds that left no time for correction. He survived the approach. He was good at surviving things that killed other people. It was, in a sense, the most fundamental skill his existence had given him the opportunity to develop. Prakith appeared on his sensors as a dense, heavy world, with the atmospheric signature of a place that had not seen direct sunlight through its cloud layers in a very long time. He could feel the dark side from outside the atmosphere. Not a subtle awareness, not the kind of presence that required attentiveness and training to perceive. A pressure, a weight on his consciousness that began before he had entered the gravity well and increased steadily as he descended. By the time he broke through the upper cloud layers, the sensation had become something more specific than pressure, something directional, something that was not merely there, but aware. He filed that information carefully. The awareness in the planet's dark side field was one of the things the fragmentary records had warned about, not in those exact terms. The old texts had used language more suited to theology than analysis, but translated into the framework of a Sith scholar who understood the mechanics behind such things. The warning reduced to the thing that persisted in the Nexus was not passive. It was watching. It knew he had arrived. It was, in whatever way its reduced form of existence allowed, already responding to his presence. He landed in the settlement nearest to the tomb. The Prakith, who had maintained their culture around the God King's memory for millennia, had not remained static across that time. They had technology now, more than their ancestors had possessed when Andeddu conquered them, accumulated through centuries of careful selection of what outside contact to permit and what to reject. They had not, however, changed the fundamental architecture of their belief. The God King was sleeping. The tomb must be protected. An outsider arriving in a ship from off-world with the clear intention of approaching the tomb was not ambiguous in their theology. He was a desecration that needed to be stopped. They came for him before he had finished securing his ship. There were a lot of them. Wylock had expected this. The Andeddu faithful had been maintained in specifically militant form by the nature of their doctrine. Their entire religious function for thousands of years had been to fight people exactly like him. They had Sith-derived techniques in their arsenal, diluted and altered by centuries of transmission through non-force-sensitive conduits, but still recognizable as descending from what Andeddu had taught the first generation of force-sensitive Prakith before his death. They were not Sith Lords, but they were not unprepared amateurs either. They were specialists. They had trained for this specific scenario across more generations than the civilization of the New Republic had existed. He fought through them, not easily. The word easily would be a significant misrepresentation of what the battle for the approaches to Andeddu's tomb actually involved. It involved sustained, concentrated effort at levels that Wyalok had not been called on to maintain in some time, against opponents who knew their terrain and their purpose and who were not, individually or collectively, afraid of dying for the God they had been raised to serve. They threw themselves at him in waves. The ones at the front died first. The ones behind them stepped over the bodies and kept coming. The ones behind those closed the gap with a calm that was more disturbing than rage would have been, because rage eventually exhausts itself and calm does not. He cut through them with the methodical precision of someone who had survived long enough to know that fighting badly uses more energy than fighting correctly. He used the Force as a weapon and a shield in combination, not alternating between them but running both simultaneously, maintaining the offensive pressure that kept his path forward clear while sustaining the defensive awareness that prevented him from being flanked by opponents he had not accounted for. The Sith sorcery in his arsenal was particularly effective here. The cultists were trained to fight conventional Force users. They were less well-equipped for the specific things that a master of Sith sorcery could do, for the way it operated on the mind and the environment simultaneously, and for the particular quality of its destructive application. He reached the tomb. The outer entrance was exactly as the records had suggested, stone carved from the rock of Prakith itself, not constructed on top of the surface, but driven deep into it, as though Andeddu had wanted the tomb to be part of the planet rather than sitting on it. The dark side energy here was not the diffuse atmospheric weight he had felt on descent. It was concentrated, focused, the architectural equivalent of the difference between ambient heat and a flame held directly against the skin. He could feel it pushing back as he approached, and the quality of that resistance told him clearly that it was not mechanical. Something inside knew he was coming. Something inside was deciding what to do about it. He went in. The corridors of the tomb were designed to be disorienting, not merely physically, though they accomplished that with real skill, with passages that curved subtly in ways that made maintaining directional awareness genuinely difficult, with intersections that were geometrically misleading, with chambers that should have connected to spaces that they did not connect to. The disorientation was also something deeper. The dark side energy in the stone was not passive background. It interacted with the Force perception of the person moving through the space, introducing subtle distortions in the way the Force revealed the environment. A Jedi, or even a less experienced Sith, navigating by Force sense, would find that sense consistently undermined. Routes that felt clear led to dead ends. Dangers that felt distant were close. Spaces that felt open were not. Wyalok had prepared for this. He had studied the underlying mechanics of how Sith tombs interacted with Force perception, and he understood that the key to navigating such spaces was not to fight the distortion, but to account for it. He moved through the tomb with his Force senses calibrated to assume that his first impression of any given passage or junction was likely to be inverted from the reality. The opposite of what the tomb was telling him was often closer to the truth. It was a strange way to navigate, requiring a particular kind of discipline. The discipline of systematically distrusting your own perceptions. Andeddu would have appreciated the irony of that. If appreciation had remained available to him in any meaningful form, the traps were physical and force-based in alternating layers. Mechanisms in the stone that activated when the wrong kind of weight was distributed across the floor of a corridor. Sith wards carved into walls that released stored dark side energy toward a force-sensitive intruder who touched the wrong surface. Chambers that sealed behind their occupant when a specific threshold of force use was detected within them, sealing them in with whatever the chamber was designed to contain. The design philosophy throughout was consistent. It assumed a powerful force user who was confident in their ability to handle direct confrontation and was designed to create situations where direct confrontation was exactly the wrong response. Weirlock was, among his other qualities, a patient man. He moved through each section of the tomb at the pace that the section required, rather than the pace his urgency demanded. When a corridor needed to be read before it was traversed, he read it. When a ward needed to be studied and neutralized before the space it guarded could be crossed, he studied and neutralized it. When a chamber sealed behind him and presented a situation that needed to be resolved before forward progress was possible, he resolved it. Not quickly, correctly. He understood that his master's need for the holocron was urgent. But he also understood that arriving at the inner chamber dead was not a better outcome than arriving there slowly. The inner approaches to the burial chamber were different from the outer sections in quality rather than quantity of threat. The outer defenses had been designed to handle the most common type of intruder, which was someone powerful enough to reach Prakith and fight through the cultists, but not powerful enough or knowledgeable enough to navigate what came next. The outer defenses would kill most such intruders. For the ones they did not kill, the inner approaches were designed by Andeddu for a specific purpose. Not to kill the intruder, to assess them. He felt it clearly as he entered the inner section. The quality of the dark side energy changed, became more deliberate, more specific in its attention. The diffuse awareness he had sensed since atmospheric entry had sharpened into something focused entirely on him. Something that was not merely registering his presence, but actively examining it, measuring capability, testing responses, forming judgments. He had been in the presence of Sith Lords more powerful than himself and had not enjoyed the experience. This was different from that, and in certain ways worse. Power had a quality he recognized and could orient around. This had a quality he recognized and could not fully name. It was the attention of something that had been thinking about intruders like him for a very long time and had developed very specific opinions about what to do with them. He arrived at the burial chamber. It was large. Larger than the outer dimensions of the tomb's visible structure should have permitted, which was itself a demonstration of the kind of spatial manipulation that powerful Sith sorcery could achieve in stone, saturated with dark side energy over thousands of years. The ceiling was high enough that the far reaches of it disappeared into shadow, even with his force-enhanced perception operating at full capacity. The walls bore carvings that he recognized as Sith script in a form so ancient that it predated the standardization of the written language. So old that even his expertise required careful attention to pass. What he could read, as his attention moved across the walls while the rest of his awareness maintained its vigilance toward the center of the chamber, were not narrative accounts or historical records. They were philosophical statements, the distilled conclusions of a lifetime's thinking about a single problem. Sentences that had been carved into stone, not to be read by future generations, but because the mind that produced them had needed to put them somewhere outside itself, to externalize them, to confirm that they were real by making them physical. Death is the failure of the self to endure. Power is the capacity to prevent failure. Therefore, power, taken to its logical conclusion, is the prevention of death. He had time to read 2 more inscriptions before the chamber stopped, pretending to be empty. It arrived, the way pressure arrives when a confined space is breached. Not gradually, all at once. The air in the burial chamber changed its character in a single moment, becoming heavier in a way that was not about atmospheric composition, but about force density, as though the ambient energy of the room had been gathering itself and had now gathered enough. Weirlock felt it first as a weight on his chest, then as a sound that was not quite a sound, then as a presence that was unmistakably there, unmistakably oriented toward him, and unmistakably not interested in explaining itself. Darth Andeddu manifested in the burial chamber of his own tomb, and he was not diminished. That was the thing that took a half-second for Weirlock to process, and that half-second was costly. The records, the fragments, the academic assessments of what might persist after millennia in a nexus of this kind had suggested reduction, attenuation, a presence strong enough to be real but weakened by the constraints of its form, a being of considerable original power reduced to something that could be confronted by a sufficiently capable and prepared Sith Lord. The records had been wrong. Or Andeddu had not reduced the way the records anticipated, or the thousands of years of dark side feeding from the nexus and the faith of the cultists and the particular character of his own will had sustained him at a level that was not meaningfully less than what he had been in life. What Weirlock faced in that burial chamber was the full force of one of the oldest and most obsessive minds in Sith history, housed in a form that was not biological, but was not therefore lesser. It was a presence that filled the chamber the way the dark side filled Prakith's atmosphere, completely, without gaps. It did not attack immediately. This was the most frightening thing. An immediate attack would have been understandable. It would have fit a pattern that Weirlock was prepared for. And fitting a pattern means the opponent has given you information about their nature. The delay was a different kind of information. It meant the thing in front of him was thinking, assessing, considering its options and selecting among them with the deliberateness of something that had been doing nothing but thinking for a very long time and was not going to rush the first meaningful decision it had made in thousands of years. When Andeddu spoke, the voice was everywhere in the room simultaneously, not localized to the approximate center of the manifestation. The way the voice of a living being is localized to the approximate location of their mouth. It came from the walls and the floor and the ceiling, and from somewhere behind Weirlock's own thoughts, as though it was not producing sound so much as producing the impression of sound in the awareness of anyone present. He said that Weirlock had come a long way. He said it the way a host says it to a guest who has traveled far to attend a gathering, with a hospitality that was clearly not genuine, with the calm of something that did not feel any particular time pressure around the conversation that was about to happen. Weirlock said what he had come for. He was direct about it. The holocron. He was here for the holocron, and he was prepared for whatever was between him and it. What happened next in that burial chamber was not a simple confrontation. It was not a duel in any form that the word usually implies. It was an attack of a kind that Weirlock had understood intellectually was possible and had prepared for in the way that you can prepare for something you have never actually experienced. Which is to say, not fully. Andeddu moved toward possession, essence transfer, in its most aggressive application, is not merely moving a consciousness from a dying body into a willing new host. It can be turned outward. It can be directed at a living being whose body is functioning perfectly well and who has no interest in hosting another consciousness. The technique in that form is not a transfer so much as an invasion, a forcing of the self into the occupied space of another mind. The defender must resist not only the raw force power of the attacker, but the specific quality of an alien will attempting to establish itself where another will already exists, trying to take root in mental terrain that belongs to someone else. Andeddu had spent his entire existence developing this capability. He had encoded it in the holocron, not in its aggressive form, because the aggressive form was not something he had ever expected to need when he was alive. It was something that had evolved in the darkness of the tomb across the centuries, a modification of the original technique, adapted to the conditions of his form of existence, sharpened and refined by thousands of years of having nothing else to refine. He had never actually used it on a living opponent before. He had been saving it for exactly this situation. He used it on Warlock. The experience, from Warlock's perspective, was one of the most alarming things that had ever happened to him in a life that had not been short on alarming experiences. It began as a sensation at the edges of his mental architecture, a pressure at the boundaries of his sense of self that had no external physical source. Then it became something more specific, the intrusion of another presence into his own perceptual space, not attacking his thoughts, trying to replace them, trying to occupy the structural positions that his own consciousness occupied, to insert itself into the mechanisms of awareness and will and identity that made him Warlock rather than just a body. He fought back with everything he had, not with the Force as a weapon in the external sense. You cannot use Sith lightning against a presence that is inside your own mind. You fight that with the same thing it is using against you, which is pure will. The strength of the self, the coherence of the identity, the refusal of the consciousness to give up the territory it occupies. This is a different kind of combat than anything that happens between two beings using the Force as an external medium. It is invisible to any observer. It produces no light and no sound and no visible effect. It looks from the outside like a being standing still in a room. From the inside, it feels like the most fundamental thing you are being contested at its foundations. Andeddu was extraordinary at this. He had been extraordinary at it when he was alive, and the millennia since his death had not diminished the core capability that made it possible. His will was the thing about him that had outlasted everything else. His body, his empire, his civilization, his political arrangements, his physical research notes, all of it was gone. His will was still here, still coherent, still pressing with the focused, patient intensity of something that had been doing nothing but maintaining itself for longer than most civilizations endure. He came very close to winning. Warlock felt the edges of himself blurring, felt the specific texture of Andeddu's presence trying to establish itself in the spaces of his perception, felt his own sense of self becoming uncertain in ways that he had not experienced since the earliest stages of his Sith training, when the fundamental question of what a self was and what gave it its coherence was still new, and the answers were not yet settled. This was worse than that early uncertainty. This was not a philosophical challenge. It was a structural attack. Something was trying to unmake him and remake him from the inside out. He found the thing that saved him in the most fundamental description of what he was, not in any specific technique or any specific source of power, in the clarity about his purpose. He was here for Crate. He was here for the holocron. He was here for a reason that existed outside himself, a mission that required him to remain himself in order to complete it. The self that Andeddu was trying to displace was the self that was going to walk out of this tomb with what Crate needed. That self had a reason to persist that Andeddu's invading presence did not have. He used Sith sorcery of a kind that he had never had occasion to use on another Force user in quite this application, techniques drawn from the oldest layers of his training, from the study of how the dark side interfaces with consciousness, and how that interface can be disrupted. He turned them inward, not outward toward an opponent, inward toward the invading presence, trying to establish itself in his own mind. And he applied them at the structural level where the invasion was happening. It was, he would reflect afterward, the most technically demanding thing he had ever done. Not because the techniques themselves were beyond his mastery, because applying them required a split in his own awareness that was extraordinarily difficult to maintain. Part of him resisting the invasion, part of him operating the techniques that would end it, both at the same time, neither able to give way to the other. But he had the advantage that Andeddu lacked. He was alive. He had the full biological infrastructure of a living Force user operating at its highest capacity. The form of Andeddu's existence, for all that it had maintained its coherence and its power over millennia, was constrained by what a post-biological presence in a dark side nexus could access and sustain. It was formidable. It was not equivalent to what Wylock had available in terms of raw operational capacity. The gap was narrow, but narrow was enough. He pushed back. With everything that defined him, every year of training, every technique he had mastered, every fragment of understanding about the Force and the dark side, and the mechanics of consciousness that he had accumulated in a lifetime of scholarship applied to the single most important problem he had ever faced, which was the problem of remaining himself long enough to win this. Andeddu's presence in his mind recoiled, not willingly, not smoothly, with the resistance of something that has been close enough to its objective to almost touch it and is now being torn away from that proximity. The quality of the resistance told Wylock something important. The presence that was fighting him was not calm anymore. The patience and the deliberateness that had defined its behavior since it manifested in the burial chamber were gone. What remained in their place was something raw and more recognizable, something that Wylock had seen in opponents before. In the final moments, when they understood what was about to happen, Andeddu was afraid. Of course he was afraid. He had always been afraid. Fear was the engine that had driven every decision he had ever made, the fuel that had powered the greatest and most sustained act of will in the history of the Sith. He had been afraid of death for thousands of years, and he had been building his answer to that fear for exactly that long. And now, the answer was failing. The vessel he had been trying to take, the living body that would have let him return to the world and continue the work that his death had interrupted, was proving resistant in a way he had not fully anticipated. The gap between what the theory had predicted and what the reality was delivering was becoming visible. Weirlock poured everything remaining into the final expulsion. The Sith lightning that he released in that moment was not directed outward at the manifestation of Andeddu's presence in the room. It was directed inward, into himself, into the space where the intruding consciousness was trying to maintain its grip. A controlled burn of such precise application that it damaged the invader without destroying the host. He felt the pain of it. It was considerable. He did not stop. The pain was useful. The pain confirmed that what he was doing was reaching the thing he needed to reach. Andeddu's presence in his mind came apart. Not all at once. In layers, the way complex structures come apart when their foundational elements are removed. First, the edges of the intrusion lost coherence, the outer reaches of the invading consciousness becoming diffuse and uncertain. Then the center of it, the part that had the most distinct identity, the part that was most recognizably the self that Andeddu had maintained in the darkness for so long, contracted and contracted again, and then was gone. The burial chamber was still. The quality of the dark side energy in it had changed. The weight that had filled the room when Andeddu manifested had not entirely dissipated, because the nexus itself was intact and would take more than this to diminish. But the directed awareness that had made the energy feel conscious had gone out of it. The chamber felt like a tomb now, in the way that the word is usually meant. A place where something had been, not a place where something was. Weirlock stood in the silence of the burial chamber of the God King of Prakith and took a moment to assess himself. He was intact. He was himself. The self that Andeddu had tried to displace was still the self that occupied the body standing in the deepest chamber of the tomb. This was, given what had almost happened, more of an achievement than most of his career's accomplishments. He found the holocron where the records had suggested it would be. In the innermost space of the burial chamber, in the location that Andeddu had chosen for it, surrounded by what remained of the dark side wards that had once guarded it and had been diminished by the battle in the chamber. It was a physical object, crystalline and dark, with the specific quality of presence that Sith holocrons carry when they have been imbued by a powerful enough maker. He could feel it even before he touched it, could feel the echo of the consciousness that had created it, encoded into the crystal along with the knowledge it contained, could feel, in that echo, the character of Andeddu himself, not the desperate, grasping presence that had tried to take him apart moments ago, but the version that had existed when the holocron was made, patient, cold, deeply, comprehensively afraid, and building something magnificent in the architecture of that fear. He picked it up. He sealed it into the containment he had brought for it. He turned and walked back through the tomb, navigating the corridors with slightly less difficulty now, because the intelligence that had been shaping the environment's interaction with his force sense was no longer operating at full capacity. He fought through the remaining cultists on the approach to his ship, and there was still a significant number of them. But the quality of the fight had changed. The death of Andeddu's presence in the tomb had not broken the faith of the Prakith. That faith was too deep and too structural to be ended by a single event, even an event of this magnitude, but it had changed the intensity of their coordination. Something that had been organizing them from the darkness of the Nexus was no longer doing so. They were still dangerous. They were less dangerous than they had been. He reached his ship. He left Prakith. He carried the holocron back to Darth Crate, and in doing so he completed the longest chain of custody that any single piece of Sith knowledge has ever traveled. From Andeddu's original research, through the encoding of the holocron, through the thousands of years of the tomb's preservation, to the hands of Krait's most trusted servant. The knowledge inside that crystal had waited longer to be used than most civilizations take to rise and fall. Krait studied the holocron. He studied it with the urgency of a being who is aware of the precise nature of the countdown running in his body, and who understands that the answer to it may be in his hands for the first time in his very long search. The gatekeeper that manifested when he opened the holocron was recognizably Andeddu, not the depleted and desperate presence that Wyerlok had encountered in the tomb. The version Andeddu had encoded into the crystal when the encoding was done. The version that still carried the full weight of his personality and his philosophy and his tremendous capacity for cold, sustained, analytical application of the dark side to the problem he had been trying to solve. Krait learned from it, slowly and with great care, because the knowledge inside the holocron was not the kind that could be rushed. He applied what he learned to his own situation, to the Vong seeds in his body, and the death they were delivering, and the question of whether the techniques Andeddu had developed could be used to address the specific form his problem took. What followed was a process that took time and that did not produce immediate clarity. The knowledge was genuine. The application to his specific circumstances was not straightforward. Andeddu had developed techniques for a specific set of problems, and Krait's problems overlapped with those but were not identical. He achieved what he achieved. He found ways to use the immortality techniques to slow the progression of what the Vong seeds were doing to him. He found ways to sustain himself that extended his timeline in ways that would not have been available without the holocron. Whether he found the complete solution that Andeddu had encoded into the crystal in its fullest form is a question that the events of his reign do not answer cleanly. What is clear is that Andeddu's knowledge changed what was possible for Krait and for the one Sith tradition he had built. And then something happened that illustrated, with brutal clarity, the deepest lesson of Andeddu's existence. Something he had always known was coming and had built his entire life around preventing. Wyerlok killed Krait, not in open battle, not with the galaxy watching, in private. In a moment when Krait was weakened, the most trusted servant made the most Sith calculation available and decided that the master was a liability that needed to be addressed. The same logic that every Sith master had applied to the problem of dangerous subordinates was applied to Krait by the person he had trusted most. The person he had sent to Prakith, the person who had faced Andeddu in the burial chamber and come back with the ancient secret of immortality and given it to the man who could use it. Wyerlok killed him and declared himself the new Dark Lord. It did not work out the way he planned. Krait was not finished in the way that Wyerlok believed he was. The immortality techniques he had learned from Andeddu's holocron had done more than slow the Vong seeds. They had given Krait a connection to survival mechanisms that his most trusted servant had not fully accounted for. Krait returned. The confrontation between them when he did was the final reckoning for a relationship that had been fundamental to the One Sith's operation and ended in exactly the way that relationships in the Sith tradition have always ended. Wyerlok, who had faced Andeddu in the darkness and won, did not survive Krait's return. The One Sith War continued. Krait's story ended as it was going to end, because immortality, even the best version of it, does not mean permanent immunity from the consequences of the galaxy's choices. But that ending, when it came, was not the ending Andeddu had predicted. It was something new, something that the God King, in all his thousands of years of observation and analysis, had not fully accounted for. The possibility that the things his knowledge made possible would outrun the specific ambitions of the person who accessed it and become something beyond what either the giver or the receiver had intended. That tendency, the tendency of dangerous knowledge to propagate beyond the intentions of its origin point, is the most precise description of what Andeddu's legacy actually consists of. Because Wirelock was not the first person to study the techniques Andeddu had encoded. He was not the first to take what the God King had built and use it in ways that extended and modified the original. Across the millennia between Andeddu's death and Wirelock's mission, the fragments of his research that had escaped the tomb through various channels, through Sith scholars who encountered traces of his work in other archives, through indirect transmission in texts that cited him without naming him, through the influence he had on the broader tradition of Sith inquiry into mortality, had been working their way through the dark side tradition, with the slow persistence of water finding its way through stone. There is a direct line from Andeddu to Darth Plagueis. Plagueis, the Moon Sith Master who would eventually train Palpatine and who would be destroyed by his own apprentice in his sleep, was the most sophisticated theorist of force-based life manipulation in the history of the Sith tradition up to his time. His research into the midi-chlorians, into the mechanisms by which the Force interfaces with living biology, into the possibility of using that interface to create life and to prevent its cessation, was the most advanced work being done on the immortality question in his era. And at the deepest level of the conceptual framework he was working within, the same questions that Andeddu had asked were the questions Plagueis was asking. What is the self? What maintains it? Can that maintenance be extended indefinitely? Can the self survive the failure of its biological host? Plagueis did not know Andeddu's name, most likely. The traces of Andeddu's research that had filtered through the tradition were too old and too diffuse to carry clear attribution across the thousands of years that separated them. But the ideas that Andeddu had spent his life developing were ideas that Plagueis was developing again, independently, along different paths, but toward the same destination. The destination that every Sith Lord obsessed with survival has always been moving toward, whether they knew it or not. The destination that Andeddu had built his tomb and his holocron and his religion and his fragment of persisting consciousness to point toward. There is a direct line from Andeddu to Darth Sidious. Palpatine had access to Plagueis's research. He had been trained by Plagueis and had learned everything his master knew and then killed him before the lesson was complete. But what Plagueis had managed to transmit before his death was enough of the fundamental insight to let Palpatine carry the work forward. Sidious developed techniques for Sith spirit survival and body transfer that bore a family resemblance to the essence transfer methodology that Andeddu had pioneered, modified by 2,000 years of Sith tradition, and refined by the particular genius that Palpatine applied to everything he did. When he died above Endor and returned in clone bodies and demonstrated that death itself was not necessarily the end of a sufficiently powerful and prepared Sith Lord, he was doing something that Andeddu had understood was possible from the beginning. He was doing it badly, in circumstances that were not ideal, with resources that were not adequate, and time that was not sufficient. But he was doing it. The technique that let him survive death was a version of the technique Andeddu had encoded in the holocron in his tomb on Prakith. Removed by thousands of years and multiple degrees of intellectual inheritance, translated through the specific filters of each tradition that had carried it forward, adapted to the specific circumstances of each practitioner who had applied it. But Andeddu's in its foundations, the same root question, the same essential answer. There is a direct line from Andeddu to every Sith Lord who has ever stared into the darkness and refused to accept that the darkness would take them. This is the scale of what the God King actually built. Not an empire. Empires last until they do not last. Not a civilization. The Prakith continued after he died, and they continue still, maintaining the tomb of a god they still believe is sleeping, guarding the space where a presence persisted for millennia and was eventually extinguished by a Sith Lord who needed what the tomb contained. Not even the holocron, which Wyalok carried out of the burial chamber and delivered to Crate, and which passed through the subsequent chaos of the One Sith War, in directions that the available records do not clearly trace. What he built was a question. The same question he had been asking since childhood. What if I never had to die? He asked it so insistently, with such total commitment of his resources and his intelligence and his will, that the question itself became structural, became part of the foundation of the Sith tradition in ways that outlasted every specific answer he developed. Other Sith Lords found their own answers, some of them better than his, some of them worse. All of them descended in some meaningful sense from his insistence that the question was worth asking, and that the asking of it was not weakness, but the only rational response to an unacceptable situation. He had been right about that, in the way that a person can be right about a problem and still be destroyed by the method they choose to solve it. Death is the thing that takes everything else. He was right. It is. And the impulse to resist it, to find a way around it, to refuse the accounting that biology demands of every living thing, is not irrational. It is as human as anything that human beings do. It is as old as the first mind that understood what death was and found the understanding unacceptable. Andeddu simply had more power and more intelligence and more time and more resources than any other being in history who felt that way. He turned all of them, completely and without reservation, toward the single problem of surviving. The cost of that complete commitment was enormous and was paid almost entirely by people who did not choose to pay it. The Prakith who became test subjects, the courtiers who knew too much and disappeared, the faithful whose entire civilization was organized around his project without their meaningful consent, the galaxy at large, which carried the downstream consequences of his ideas in the form of every Sith Lord who came after him and tried to cheat death with methods he had pioneered. He is not remembered. That was his choice, and he made it deliberately. He wanted the galaxy to not know he existed. He wanted the protection of obscurity. He got it. The galaxy does not tell stories about Darth Andeddu the way it tells stories about Revan or Plagueis or even Vitiate. His name does not appear in the history taught to children, or in the records that scholars cite, or in the traditions that surviving Force users invoke to explain where they came from and what they believe. But he is there, in the way that foundations are there, not visible from the surface, not honored, not remembered, but present, at the structural level, in everything built on top of them. Every Sith Lord who sought to live forever was walking in his footsteps without knowing whose footsteps they were. Every technique for consciousness transfer and essence survival and post-death persistence that has ever been developed in the dark side tradition has its conceptual origin in the work of a being who spent centuries on a hidden world, trying to answer a question that no one before him had taken seriously enough to pursue to its conclusion. He spent his life terrified of death. He died anyway. He persisted in darkness for thousands of years, and was eventually defeated in his own tomb by a being who needed what he had built and was strong enough to take it. And the ideas he had given his entire existence to developing went on without him, carried forward by people who did not know his name, used for purposes he had not intended, producing consequences he had not foreseen. That is what happens to the knowledge of the obsessed. It outlives the obsession. It enters the stream of things that people know and are influenced by, and pass on to the next generation, stripped of the specific character of the mind that produced it, but retaining the essential shape of what that mind was trying to do. The God King of Prakith is gone. His empire is dust. His tomb still stands in the darkness of the deep core, maintained by the descendants of the civilization he built, waiting for a return that will not come. His question is still being asked. In every dark side practitioner who has faced the ending of themselves and decided that the ending is unacceptable, in every mind that has looked at the finality of death and begun calculating the ways around it, in every piece of Sith philosophy that addresses the relationship between consciousness and mortality and the possibility of making the self permanent, Darth Andeddu is present, not as a memory, not as a name, as the shape of a thought that cannot be unthought once the thinking of it begins. He died terrified of death, and the terror he felt became the architecture of a tradition that has been trying to solve the same problem he could not solve for thousands of years, and is probably still trying. That is the most terrifying thing about him. Not the power, not the cruelty, not the centuries of paranoid rule on a world that the galaxy forgot to look for. The most terrifying thing is that his fear was contagious in ways that even he did not plan for, and it spread further than he could follow, and it is still spreading. The dark side has a long memory, and so, in the deepest sense, does Darth Andeddu.